Well, all right, everyone. How are y'all today? I hope you're good. It's good to see you. Glad you're here today for our Bible study. And those of you that are joining us online, we want to welcome you today also to our Bible study for the day. And we're going to do Genesis 20 and 21. And I don't think it will garner as many questions as Sodom and Gomorrah, but we'll just see how that goes. I think we set the record last week. But today, I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here. Y'all know that tomorrow, a lot of us leave for camp. So our children will be going to camp first at Riverbend, and then next week the youth will be joining us as well. And so I will be at youth camp next week, and so someone will be teaching the pastor's Bible study. Isn't that right, Katie? Somebody? Okay. Somebody will do it, and so I just encourage you to be here, and we'll continue on through the June and July. And I appreciate our team stepping in to where we can continue to do this. That's okay with y'all, right? To just keep meeting and eating and fellowshipping? Okay, good. All right, well, today I've titled the Bible study today, Finally Isaac. And so we're going to finally get to the birth of this boy. But before we do that, we've got to do Genesis 20 first, and then we'll do Genesis 21. So if you look at Genesis 20, the text starts like this. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev, and he lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar. And there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abraham is continuing this narrative. And so Abimelech, who's the king of Gerar, we're not really sure if that's his name or if that's just the title of the king of that region, because he'll appear again in the book of Genesis. But he sent for Sarah and took her. So now we begin this very interesting story once again. It feels like a replay or a reprise, doesn't it, from what we've already seen happen in Abraham's life. But Abraham is a settler and a wanderer at the same time. He's a pilgrim. He's settling in the land of Canaan. But if you remember, he has lots of flocks. He has a huge amount of resource. And so most scholars say that there are times when Abraham moved because of a famine. We know that already. Sometimes he'll move around just because he needs to take care of his immense flocks and people. So he'll migrate and navigate in various places across Canaan. But now he's in the southern part of Canaan. We're not actually sure where Gerar is today, but we think it's on the southern end of Canaan. And they had their own king, which wasn't uncommon. We've seen that already. We've encountered various kings along the way in this story. Kings over cities, kings over regions, if you will. And so now we encounter another one. And so he chooses to take Sarah into his tent and place her among the various women that evidently he must have had as king. And as far as he knows at this point, this is Abraham's sister. Okay, so if you look at verse 3, God came to Abimelech in a dream, which is kind of interesting. Abimelech is a Philistine. He's a pagan. And God chooses to visit him in this dream and says this to him: "You are as good as dead." So a great just revelation from God for this man, his encounter with God. He says, "Because of the woman you've taken, she's a married woman." Now, Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation?" It's interesting, he refers to God as Lord, probably had this pantheon of gods, not knowing exactly who this is, but he does realize this is a deity. And he says, "Did he not say to me, 'She's my sister'? And didn't she also say, 'He's my brother'? I've done this with a clear conscience, clean hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clean conscience, and so I've kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now, return the man's wife, for he's a prophet." It's the first time that word appears in the Bible. And it's interesting, it appears in the Bible and it's given to Abraham. We don't normally list Abraham as one of our prophets whenever you're talking about the prophets in the Old Testament, but he's the first person to be called a prophet, not necessarily saying that he stands at the head of the line of all the prophets, but at least at this point in history, that's how the Lord refers to him. He says he'll pray for you and you'll live. But if you don't return her, you be sure that you and all who belong to you will die. So there's the judgment. The revelation from God to Abimelech is, you're as good as dead right now. Now, God evidently had already intervened with Abimelech, so he has not had anything to do with Sarah, probably for numerous reasons we'll get to in just a second. So once he gets this revelation, he decides to respond, because now we know that there's a curse on Abimelech. So if you look at verse 8, early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials. When he told them everything that happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You've done things to me that should never be done." And Abimelech asked Abram, "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there's surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he's my brother." So the ruse continues. It has a little bit of truth in it, but not the real whole truth. Now, those of you that are parents, you're accustomed to dealing with these kinds of situations, because sometimes we have to face that, don't we? So Abimelech, verse 14, he brought sheep and cattle and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, "My land now is before you." So this whole southern region, whatever the area is that he ruled over, he said, just live wherever you like. And to Sarah he said, "I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You're completely vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God. And notice it says, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so they could have children again. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah. So the curse, if you will, that has rested on this home has affected everybody, even the king. So somehow God has even cursed Abimelech. The text doesn't tell us exactly how, but I think the insinuation is pretty easy to understand. He hasn't touched Sarah, evidently for good reason. God's protected Sarah, but also Abimelech has been struck as well. And so then when you see all of this, there's this resolution, if you will. So here's Abraham. He's a settler because he is establishing himself in the promised land, but he's also still a wanderer, taking care of his flocks and whatever the needs are for the various seasons, and he makes his way across the land as he needs to. Now, why would Abimelech go and get Sarah once Abraham and his, who knows how many were with him, his entourage, make their way into his territory? She's 90 years old at this point. 90. Okay? So most Old Testament scholars say that this was probably not motivated by her beauty, but it was motivated by her value. In other words, Abimelech recognizes Abraham as a peer. And Abraham is a very wealthy man. And he's evidently seeking some kind of economic alliance with Abraham. And when he finds out Abraham has a sister, he goes and gets her to bring her into his house so he can bring these two kingdoms, if you will, together in an alliance. That's very common in ancient history. It takes really all the way through the Reformation era, where families in royalty would marry off their offspring to other royals so that they could kind of keep the peace with one another. That's happened all the way even really into the 20th century. And so evidently that was what was happening here. The idea was maybe we can make sure that Abraham won't declare war on us. We won't declare war on him. We can bring his sister, part of his family, into our household, and we can begin this economic alliance. That probably makes the most sense to me. However, God sends a message to Abimelech that this is not just Abraham's sister, this is Abraham's wife. And you have brought a married woman into this home. And what's interesting is, even this pagan king believes that's wrong. So think about that. Even this pagan king says, well, no, we don't do that. I wouldn't have brought her in here had I known she was actually married to this colleague of mine. That's certainly against our code of ethics, if you will. And so he realizes this is wrong. Well, meanwhile, he also knows it's wrong because there's a curse that's been inflicted on the family. Nobody can have children, and it seems like even their relationships are upset. And now he's getting a vision, a revelation from God that you're as good as a dead man walking. And so he just springs into action. And I think it's interesting that the writer tells us that he didn't go near Sarah, and that's going to be really important because of what happens on the next page. Okay, so we'll get that in just a second. But once all the dust settles and the air is cleared a little bit, then restitution is made. Abimelech says, I'm sorry. I don't want to be in this kind of tense relationship. My goal was to enter into a peaceful relationship by bringing our families together. So now I realize that's not going to happen, and I've got some kind of curse on me from some kind of God, and so I want to fix all this. And so he makes sure that Sarah even knows what he's done. He doesn't just do this in front of Abraham. He gives Abraham the flocks and the male and female servants, but he says to Sarah, I want you to notice all this money I'm giving your brother. I mean, your husband, or whoever he is. And just to make sure that everybody knows he's coming clean. And then the resolution is, it's exactly what God said could happen when Abraham prayed. God is going to lift the judgment off of this family, this home, this kingdom, if you will. And now they are healed. They now have hope for the future. They can have children again. They have their freedom. They're telling Abraham, live wherever you want to live. Our people will not bother your people. We want your people to not bother our people. And let's just live in peace. So that's how we end chapter 20, okay? Then, finally, chapter 21, Isaac. After all this time, we've been waiting. And there have been so many obstacles that have been thrown in the path of Abraham in this story. So many fears that Abraham seems to have had. We've even had them take matters into their own hands and have a child through Hagar. We've had the threat of Pharaoh. We've had the threat of Abimelech. I mean, there have just been, it seems like boulder after boulder in the way of God's ultimate plan for these people. But Abraham still receives this blessing from God. So you get to chapter 21, and let's look at what this text says. It says, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, just as he said. And the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. At the very time God promised him, Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Remember, Isaac's name is a play on words about laughter. And so whenever his name is called, we'll all laugh together that this is really hard to believe what's taken place. She says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I've borne him a son in his old age. So, incredible story. The child has been born. Verse 8. The child grew and was weaned. And on that day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman. Notice she didn't even call her by name. And her son, doesn't call him by name. For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Now there's another threat to Isaac. And that's the older brother, who some might view as the rightful heir because he's Abraham's firstborn. Okay? Verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly. You think? You know, this is kind of what polygamy does to families. Wouldn't you agree? There's all kinds of intrigue and challenges and questions and who's the favored son and how does all this work. So there's a lot happening here. But it's interesting. It says Abraham was distressed because it concerned his son. Now, which son? Is he concerned because he's worried about Isaac because of the threat Ishmael represents? Or is he worried about Ishmael because he's now had 13 or so years to raise Ishmael, and Ishmael is his son? Well, the Hebrew doesn't really tell us. Most scholars would say he's concerned about Ishmael. Okay? So God said to him, don't be so distressed about the boy, which that seems to point toward Ishmael, and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you. Now, that's just great marital advice. Y'all can just write that down. Just listen to what she says. It's probably a good thing to do. So, listen to what she says, because, and this is just a great reminder to Abraham, it's through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. I'll make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he's yours. He's connected to you. Now, there's a great little insight about how God viewed Abraham, okay? So, verse 14, early the next morning, Abraham took food, a skin of water, gave it to Hagar, set them on her shoulders, and then sent her off with the boy. And then she headed down toward the desert of Beersheba. And then this interesting thing is going to happen once she gets away from Abraham. They're going to run out of water, and she's going to be desperate. And so the question is, what's going to happen to Hagar and Ishmael now that she seems to be out of resources because she no longer has Abraham's shadow? She no longer has Abraham's tent. She no longer has Abraham's cover. Regardless of how the situation was there, in however it is in their compound, how Sarah viewed her, everybody else knew that she was the mother of Abraham's son. Does that make sense? I can promise you Hagar had standing in the compound. She's Ishmael's mother, okay? Well, now that's all gone. She's wandered now away from Abraham's protection, okay? So if you look at verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. She went off and sat down about a bow shot away, and she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And she sat there and began to sob. God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God's heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up. And he lived in the desert, and he became an archer. And while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got him a wife from Egypt. Remember, that's where she's from. So she went back to her family and secured a future for her son. Okay? So let's just talk about that for a minute, then we'll finish up this relationship between Abraham and Abimelech, and we'll talk about a few things to think about. So first of all, let's just acknowledge that the birth of Isaac is a miracle. Abraham is 100, Sarah is 90. Okay? I saw this week that Al Pacino is going to have another baby. He's 82. But his girlfriend is like 25. So there's a big difference between his story and this story. Okay? This is a couple that have been living this life before God on this long journey of faith, anticipating that at some point something was going to happen. And it's fascinating to me that as much tension that has been built in this story, if you're the writer, I think maybe you'd agree with me, the birth of Isaac is told very simply and very quickly. You know, finally, Sarah has the baby. And 8th day they circumcise him, she weans him, they throw a party. And, I mean, it's almost anticlimactic in some ways. It's just told so simply Because this is where we've been headed the whole time. This is what we have been waiting on. And when it finally happens, if Moses is the principal author, which I think he is, he tells the story simply and quickly, but don't let that confuse you. It's still an incredible miracle. I mean, this is the son of promise. And Abraham is going to celebrate everything about Isaac. He's going to celebrate even when he's weaned. So there's this tradition of acknowledging these milestones in the lives of these children. But also notice verse 12. He is clearly the son of promise. So Isaac is going to be the one that will now steward the promises given to Abraham. So now Abraham and Sarah, I'm not sure how responsible Sarah felt for Ishmael's well-being. Probably not much. But she's going to feel incredibly responsible for Isaac's well-being, because this is the promised one. This is the son through whom the Lord is going to make a great nation on Abraham's behalf. Then, while they're having this big party, for some reason, Ishmael makes fun of his brother. Now, it's a little fascinating because, when you look at this text, when you read what many commentators say, the way the NIV translates it, it says in verse 9, Sarah saw him mocking. Now, the Hebrew word that's translated mocking there, it's kind of one of those Hebrew words, like many Hebrew words, that just is pregnant with meaning. It can mean so many things. It can be something that really is not that big a deal. But it also can mean to threaten, if you will. So evidently, whatever it was that Ishmael did, that's how Sarah took it. She took it as a threat to her son, and she took it as a lack of acknowledgement of who Isaac was to become. So she told Abraham, they have to go. And so they are now going to be banned from the compound and from the family and from the storyline. And so Hagar and Ishmael leave. Now here's what's fascinating. Even after they're banned and banished, remember, Ishmael is Abraham's son. So regardless of what's happened and how it's happened, God is still going to bless Ishmael because of Abraham. Once again, this shows the value and importance of Abraham in our story. He is a chosen instrument from God. So Ishmael is going to get the grace from God because of Abraham. It's interesting how Moses tells the story. He says that when she went to place this boy under these bushes to let him die, she's a bow shot away. And then lo and behold, Ishmael grows up to be an archer. So there's a little kind of play on words there about how all this played out. And then eventually he's going to live in the desert. Now, if you fast forward to today, 21st century, who are Ishmael's physical descendants? Well, many people would say the Arabs are, but there's really actually no real proof that that's true because it's going to be a long time before people are going to be known by any name that would be affiliated with Arabs. It'll take us all the way past Muhammad before that'll happen. But regardless of who the Arabs would see as their physical heritage, because some of the most astute Arab scholars don't argue that at all. They argue their spiritual heritage is in the line of Ishmael. Does that make sense? So even if they don't see themselves as physically descending from Ishmael, they acknowledge they spiritually descend from Ishmael. And he is, to them, the son of promise. And when you get to the story that we'll see next week, where Abraham is going to offer up Isaac on Mount Moriah, in the Quran, the boy is not named. And so it doesn't call him Ishmael, and it doesn't call him Isaac. It's just Abraham's son. And so the interpretation by the imams will be that is Ishmael, not Isaac, even though he's not named. But it opens the door for them to choose the son since he's not named in the Quran. So Muhammad, I believe, did that on purpose, if that makes sense, as he shares their spiritual heritage. So God is gracious toward Ishmael. God provides miraculously. Hagar looks up and there's a well. Now, you know good and well if there had been a well there originally, she'd have seen it. She wouldn't be so desperate. But the Lord's providing for her, once again, a miraculous provision from God. Then Abimelech shows back up because he's a little bit worried about the growth of Abraham, the power of Abraham. And so he wants to make sure that they are still good. And so they come together beginning in verse 22, and they draw up a treaty with each other and decide they will live together in peace, a covenant. Abraham will bring an offering as well, and they will share these offerings with each other. And then Abraham will name the place Beersheba. He'll plant a tree there in verse 32. He'll call on the name of the Lord, and he'll call the Lord the eternal God. And he will then, the text says, stay in the land of the Philistines for a long time. So they are now at peace. Beersheba is the word beer in Hebrew means a well. So it's the well of oath. It's where they take this oath together. And Abraham will now live there in peace. Now let me just offer you just a couple things to consider about this story. First, I'd say about Abraham, he's a flawed human being. He's not perfect. He had fears. He's still struggling with some of his fear. And that's what I love about this story in the Scripture. It's honest. It allows Abraham to be who he is, and we get to watch him mature. I think we're seeing Abraham mature in his faith. We're going to see that on the next page. He grows in his faith. But here's the thing. God chose him and blessed him. And God blessed everything around him. Everybody affiliated with him. Even if some of their affiliations were a little dicey, like Ishmael and Hagar, God still blessed them. And if you messed with him, then people like Abimelech found out what happens when you mess with Abraham. God will visit you. And God protected Abraham and his family. So the hand of God is on this man. I've told y'all before, if you were to call a meeting of the most influential human beings who have ever lived on planet Earth, okay, obviously Jesus would be in a room by himself, true? But outside of Jesus, if you were going to pick the most influential human beings who have ever lived, you would have to invite Abraham to that meeting. I would probably say the Apostle Paul would be another one. But Abraham is one of the most influential men who has ever walked on this planet. And millions and millions, I would even say billions of people throughout history, up to today, still call him Father. We do. He's our Father in the faith, okay? So, Abraham was chosen by God, blessed by God. I want you to notice, though, Abraham is maturing and he's realizing this is my home. He wanders a little bit here and there, takes care of his flocks, but he's getting wells. Like one of at this treaty, he tells Abimelech, this well that I really need, your guys have been messing with it. We want it. It's ours. Abimelech says, okay. Abraham is building things around these wells. He worships God. He establishes altars. He plants trees. He gives places names that have to do with the work of God in his life. So basically what he's doing is he's establishing roots. One of the commentators I read said, every time Abraham plants a tree in the Holy Land, I'm reminded of the roots that he's making real. Because this is where he's going to live. And this is where he hopes his family is going to live. I would also tell you, God keeps his promises. God told Sarah, this is going to happen. Told Abraham this is going to happen. And God kept his promise. That's the God that we know. God keeps his promises. God is a miracle-working God. You know, with Abimelech, think about it. A part of the miracle in Abimelech's life was a curse. They couldn't have any children anymore. God just closed up the womb of everyone associated with Abimelech. It's interesting that when Abraham prays and all of a sudden the barrenness is removed, then the very next page, his wife's barrenness was removed. So you've got this juxtaposition of a very interesting turn of events where Abimelech and his family all of a sudden couldn't have children. Or Abraham and Sarah couldn't have children. Then Abraham prays. Now Abimelech and his family can have children. And now Abraham and Sarah can have children. So there's this miraculous intervention from God in this story. Well, I believe that God works miracles. I believe God worked miracles throughout the biblical era. I don't believe the miraculous power of God ended when the Scripture closes. God is still a miracle-working God. But here's the thing about God. He works on His own timetable, not ours. And so we don't demand miracles from God. He's not a genie in a lamp. That's not how this works. He's the God of the universe. And He is going to work things according to His power and His will, and He will do it in His own way and in His own time. And sometimes you and I will not even recognize the miracles when they happen. But they are miracles nonetheless, because God still intervenes in people's lives. I'm going to talk a little bit about this coming Sunday morning. I believe in the miracle working power of God. I believe we as believers still should pray for miracles. We should still ask God for miracles. You know, I'll never forget, I was in a mission meeting years ago with Bill O'Brien, and Bill's wife, Delana, used to be the executive director of the Women's Missionary Union. Many of y'all may remember Delana and Bill O'Brien. He was vice president of the IMB for a long time. And Bill O'Brien was helping us get all our mission work started. And, you know, Bill's gone on to be with the Lord. I wish he could have been here Sunday. I wish he could have been here Sunday, because his fingerprints are all over what we do. He's had a huge impact on my missiology. But anyway, Bill was in a meeting with us, and he had just gotten back from a meeting in Asia. And we were just talking about, you know, churches sending missionaries and all that. He said, well, let me just tell you what just happened to me while I was in Asia. He said, I was in a meeting with a group of pastors, and we were discussing what was happening in this church planting movement. And he said, and somebody came in the meeting and said something to one of the pastors. He said, the pastor stood up and said, Dr. O'Brien, I'm so grateful you're here with us. Thank you for meeting with us. Thank you for everything you're doing. I must leave and go back to my village. And I'm very sorry about that. And everybody said, okay, that's okay. And they said, well, why are you leaving? He said, well, one of the men in our church, one of our elders in our church has died, and I need to get back to see if I can raise him from the dead, because what we've learned is we don't have much time to raise somebody from the dead when they die, and if we wait too late, it can't happen. I need to get back as quickly as possible to see if I can bring my brother back. And he said he just goes out the door. And Bill said, we all just sat there like, what? And it was like this guy said it like, well, you know, all of y'all believe that God raises people from the dead, right? I mean, we are Christians. And then he just heads out. O'Brien said to me, it was one of the most humbling meetings of my life, because here I'm sitting here with my doctor's degree, my pedigree as a missiologist. I've led the largest mission sending agency in the world, and I've got a young pastor looking at me saying, I got to go back and raise the dead. I'll see y'all if I make it back. I'll see you when I get back. Awesome. Well, the point being, God works miracles, but He doesn't just sprinkle them out of a salt shaker indiscriminately. That's not how it works. God's in partnership with us, and He's leading us on a journey of faith with Him. And God's work many times is as much about shaping us and forming us as it is anything. And so I would just tell you, you shouldn't be shy or embarrassed about asking the Lord for miracles, but then we should also ask the Lord to give us the eyes to see them when they actually happen, because they may not come in the form that we anticipated them. Okay? So His power continues to be on display, in my opinion, in history today and in times past. And then finally, Galatians 4. I just want to point you to it real quickly, because you can't do all this story without at least mentioning Paul. You know, Paul loves these stories in the Old Testament, and he will use them to teach theology in the New Testament. And so in Galatians 4, he does that with Hagar and Sarah. And he uses Hagar and Sarah to help us understand the covenant working power of God, and the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, and the difference between the way of Ishmael and the way of Isaac. And so he uses that imagery in Galatians 4, and here's what he says, Galatians 4:21, he says, tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? Now he's talking to people who are trying to convince Christians they have to keep the Deuteronomic law of Moses in order to be authentic Christians. He says, it is written, verse 22, that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman, the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of the divine promise. And then he tells the story that we just read. And he mentions that Ishmael, and Paul says, persecuted Isaac. That's the word he uses. So Paul takes whatever Ishmael did at that big party as threatening to Isaac. And then he offers two pathways. The pathway of Ishmael is the pathway of slavery. It's the pathway of the flesh. But the pathway of Isaac is the spiritual path. It's the path to freedom. And Paul says that's who we are. So we've just read about that. We've read about now how the story of these two boys is going to now diverge. Their story has been linked. Now they're going to diverge. And Ishmael is going to represent the way of the flesh, and Isaac is going to represent the way of the promise, both literally and theologically, according to Paul's interpretation.